Great. Well, good afternoon, Fresh Minds Network, near and far. My name is James Callender. I'm one of the managing directors here at Fresh Minds. And this is certainly for me, my first webinar, but very excited about our series of webinars that we've got coming up. For those of you who don't know Fresh Minds, we're a resourcing and consulting business, helping find people on a permanent basis, a project basis, but also finding project teams for companies around the world. We are running, given this extraordinary times we live in, we decided it would be helpful for our network to run a series of about 6 or 7 seminars, webinars over the next sort of 12 weeks or so. And we've had some fantastic speakers who've agreed to speak. So next week we've got Terry McCain, ex-McKinsey, who now runs Manners, who is going to be talking about psychological safety. Talking about red teaming. And in a minute, I'll introduce Chris, who's going to be talking about planning. So webinar, we've got an hour. Chris will start in a moment and speak for about 45 minutes. And at the end, we should have some questions, which you can type into the Zoom question thing, and we'll try to filter out some good questions at the end to pick up any threads that maybe were left unanswered. Our speaker this evening is Chris Paton, the MD of Quirk Solutions. Before he was advising commandos and led David Cameron's exit strategy from Afghanistan. A man who enjoys planning under pressure, something a lot of us have been doing in the last couple of weeks. And now to share some of his hints, tips, and advice about planning under pressure, a warm virtual welcome to Chris Paton. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Thanks very much, and good afternoon, everybody. So let's dive straight into it, really. I mean, whether I have been in my previous career as a Royal Marine and working in places like Afghanistan or Helmand, or over the last 8 years where I've been working commercially with all sorts of organizations of different scales and sizes and sectors, you often find yourself in what the Royal Marines would describe as a suboptimal situation, what most of us refer to as a crisis. And the issue with that, the problem with that, this type of situation essentially is that it's highly emotional. As soon as we find ourselves in a crisis management situation, our inner chimp kicks in and we start to get into that fight or flight response. So we feel a need to do something, do anything we can. We feel a need for action and to take something forward. It also means that actually, if we're not careful, it becomes quite addictive. Lots of people like this type of situation. They like the pressure, they like the challenge of it because they thrive on it. And the reason for that is that we all have our System 1 and System 2 brains. For those of you that read your Daniel Kahneman and Thinking Fast and Slow, the System 1 brain essentially is our reactive, instinctive brain that kicks in to save us. So when we're faced with a difficult situation, it takes over and makes a decision for us rapidly. The System 2 brain is the slower, much more analytical, much more resourceful brain. Now, as humans, actually, we don't like using System 2 anyway, because we're inherently lazy. We like to just do System 1, nice and quick, nice and easy, make a decision and move on. And the problem with a crisis situation is that that is basically playing to that issue. We are using more and more and more that System 1 brain and making instinctive reactions. Now, sometimes in a crisis, we need to make gut instinctive reactions, absolutely. You know, when the bullets are flying past my head, the first thing I need to do is to hit the ground and crawl somewhere that I'm out of range of those bullets. I'm hidden from them. That is a System 1 response, and that is absolutely right in that moment in time. I'm not going to stand there and wander around for a bit going, now I wonder, what should I do given this situation? It's not going to happen. But quickly then, we need to try and slow ourselves down and get into the System 2 brain. So have a little think about the fact that just as panic is infectious, and why we've seen toilet rolls disappearing off the shelves and everything else, okay, because of the panic and it's spreading the same panic, calm is also equally infectious. So this is a time where, whether you're a leader of a team or you're a member of a team, the more compassionate that you are right now, the more caring that you are, the more thoughtful that you are with your other team members, the more rational you come across and steady, the more that will affect them in a positive way and help them with the situation. So that's the first thing we really need to think about, is how can we start to work to stabilize how other people are feeling. And I know it sounds slightly counterintuitive, but at a time like this, actually you need to spend more time on people's feelings, thoughts and emotions and being aware of those than you do normally, because people are going to be fearful, they are going to be anxious, and you need to deal with that, otherwise they'll just become paralyzed. The next point really is all about purpose. For some of us, we are now working virtually across the whole business, and therefore some people are feeling a bit lost, because what they were used to is to go into work every day and to do their job, and now that that job is no longer really there, for some organizations who've got people on furlough on 80% salaries or are setting that up, yes, those individuals are at home and they're getting a salary, but they feel a bit lost. So again, have a think within your organization about how you can give people purpose. And it might not necessarily be the purpose that your organization actually exists for right now. It might be something as simple as getting in touch with a local residential care home, setting up some FaceTiming between you and some of the residents in that care home, so you build up a relationship and talk to them about it, about what's going on. That is still serving a purpose. That's still going to help people feel good about themselves. And that is a really important part of this whole process of being in a crisis, giving people a sense that they're doing well, they're achieving something. Finally, the last bit here is around what you can control and what you can't control. If you are in a ship in the middle of a hugely volatile, stormy sea, you can't control the waves. You can't control the storm. So there's no point in trying to work out how to control that and worrying about it. You can try and predict a little bit about what's coming, so we can try and work out how long this situation we're now in might last, what that might mean for us. But there's no point in trying to put in place any controls around that. What we can control is the ship, the crew, and ourselves. So start to think about that when you're in a crisis management situation. So essentially, if we wanted to kind of summarize that, business performance, if you do the studies, okay, are based on these 7 disciplines that we have here. Situational awareness, okay, absolutely key. And we'll come on to a minute about being swamped by data and by analysis, but understanding what is going on. Obviously, coping with fatigue and managing the stress, because people will be stressed, you will be stressed, and that therefore causes tiredness. When you are tired, when you are stressed, and when you don't have a full grasp of the facts, you tend to make poor decisions. Down at the bottom of the screen there. If you make poor decisions, you find your leadership starts to be affected, even if that's self-leadership of yourself, because you feel the pressure of that poor decision. Once you feel the pressure of that poor decision, that affects the way you communicate, which then affects the team around you. So we need to try and work out ways in which we can deal with these 7 disciplines, deal with this business performance, and move forward. So what I'm going to do now, if that was the problem, is I'm going to take you through some of the ideas I feel that how you can address these. Now, it's very difficult to talk on a webinar where everybody on there is from different organizations at different scales, different sizes, may have a different role within that organization. So for me to give a specific leadership talk at a specific cohort level might not apply to everybody. So what I've done is instead I've put it into a set of principles, 5 principles of keeping it simple, communicate, trusting the team, planning, and then testing the plan. And I'm going to take you through each of those briefly now. I won't have the opportunity in sort of 45 minutes to go into it in particular depth, but hopefully then the questions that you can ask, and please do feel free to ask questions as I'm talking. Don't wait just to ask all your questions at the end, because it's really helpful to be able to see your questions as we're going along. So even though I'm talking, I'm scanning the questions and I can start to think about my response as it comes towards the end. So let's kick into the first principle of keeping it simple. We don't have to dwell too much on this because a lot of it is self-explanatory, okay? It's all about focus, and focus on what is happening right now. When people are in a crisis management situation in a commercial context or an organizational context, what can often happen is that they worry about the impact the current situation is going to be having on their business plan strategy. And that might be a strategy that they've got set out for the next 2 years, 3 years. That isn't helpful because you've got too many factors at play. There's too many permutations in play there. So bring it right back to the time that we are in right now. And I know that sounds blindingly obvious, but it's not just the time that you're in right now. I also want you to think very carefully about the time you come out of this crisis, okay? Because when you come out of this crisis, you can't just bring everybody back into work, sit down at everybody's desks and pretend that you're back at the 1st of March 2020. It's not going to happen. Some people will have got used to working in a different way, the way that we are working right now, and will want to carry on that way. The business may no longer be suited to the environment and the market that has now come out and emerged from the other side of this. Your business strategy may no longer be valid. So there's all sorts of areas that are going to change in the way that you go about things. Maybe you're even a bit more risk averse now because of the experiences we've just gone through over the last 2-3 months. So focus really closely on a short timeline, this week, this month, and maybe the return to work, and that is pretty much it. The next one, what do you mean, is about asking better questions. The tendency when we are in a crisis management situation is to try and gain reassurance, because that's what we like as human beings. We like to be reassured by gathering as much information as we possibly can, because by having all of that information, we therefore must understand what's going on, okay? It's not helpful. You're going to drown under all of the data that comes in. It's not going to help you move forward. So think about, as a friend of mine says, Graham Hogg, who's based out in New York, really great guy, who wrote a book called Seeing Around Corners. Ask better questions. So instead of trying to look for all the data, then work out what this means, ask yourself the question, what do we need to achieve by the end of this week, say? Or what do we need to achieve by the end of a fortnight? Now, what information do I need right now that informs that decision? And only look for that data and that detail. Don't get distracted by shiny things all over the place and feeds in from this and that and the 5 o'clock briefing that's happening every day. Just focus on what you need to make that decision. So ask better questions. Where do we want to be when we come out the other side of this? How long do we think that might be? So if that's one of your key questions, how long do we think this might last? Only go and look for data that starts to give you an understanding of that. The last thing then is understanding, as I mentioned in my intro, how we slow down to speed up, okay? Yes, there are times at which we've got to make snap, instinctive decisions, but actually we need to be really careful to step away from that as quickly as we can. Slow down, think, be rational, and start to consider all the different permutations and angles so that we can be creative about what we're doing. And that allows us to go much faster rather than firefighting the whole time. Because again, if you are in a team or if you're leading a team, if you go into this situation all guns blazing, as if it's going to finish tonight, you will not survive 2 weeks. You certainly won't survive a month because you'll just burn out. So you've got to think very carefully about managing your level of effort and the levels of effort of the people around you and sharing the burden across the team. And we'll come on in a little bit about how best you can share the burden across the team without losing control when we come on to trust and trust in a team. So let's have a look at communicating now and how we go about communicating, okay? There's some fairly simple principles you can think of in this piece, all right, about accuracy, brevity, and clarity. When we are in a fast-moving, very fluid situation, it is not the time for long, drawn-out soliloquies, okay? We have to be very concise, very to the point. But there's two other things I want to discuss here and to bring to your attention here in the way that we communicate before I then give you a tool, okay, a technical concept that you can start to go away and use. Because what I'm trying to do with this talk is to give you some of the human, behavioral, emotional aspects, but also some technical tools that you can take away. One of the first tools, though, I want to take away is actually an emotional one, if you like, because it's my daughter, Tiggy, who you can see at bottom left there on the screen, who works in farming, right? And it's the Tiggy test. When you are starting to put together your communication, when you're starting to map out your slide or your briefing or your email, or you're putting down your notes for a call you're going to have, like on Zoom like this with the rest of your team, think very carefully about the person at the other end. Okay, so this is the Tiggy test. I challenge all my clients and all the people that I work with when we're doing this leadership work to write down their communication in a way such that I could put it in front of Tiggy and she would understand it. So all that management speak, all terms like stakeholders and everything else like that, they're people. So call them people. Help the individuals at the other end of the communication you're saying to, help them, the people that are responding to it, understand what you're saying. The worst thing that we can do as leaders or managers or team leaders is to write down something that makes absolute sense to us, because we're not asking ourselves to do anything. We're asking other people to do it for us. So think about the person who is going to be at the sharp end receiving this communication, and think about what they understand, the language that they use on a day-to-day basis, and write it in that way. So use that Tiggy test to try and think about the audience, not you as an individual. The next thing is to do a Dan. Okay, my son Dan is very confident individual, to put it mildly, and he does not see the point in not saying the difficult issue. Let's not beat about the bush. Let's get the difficult issue right out there. For some of you right now, and for some people across the nation, across the world right now, they are facing an issue where they are going to potentially restructure their organization. Perhaps there are going to have to be redundancies, even despite the financial support that the government is bringing in. But they don't want to talk to their teams about that because, well, they don't want people to worry too much. They don't want to have that psychological impact. But you know what? Actually, right now, that's all those individuals are thinking about. Right? This is a fantastic HBR article written by Hamel and Prahalad called Strategic Intent. And they have this phrase within there that essentially, if you don't lance that boil, if you don't get that issue out into the open, you can talk as much as you like about all the things that are going to happen and the positive things and how we're going to get through this and be very reassuring as a leader. But all they're hearing at the other end is blah, 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 blah. All they're thinking about is, but we're going to go under here. There's going to have to be redundancy. So you may as well get on with it, do a Dan, and get it out in the open. Okay. So how can we communicate really simply and clearly? Now, the issue we often have, if we are more senior, we've been doing this for a little while, is that we've heard of things like a mission statement, okay? And then we've heard of things like a vision statement. We don't really understand, if we're honest, what the difference is between those two. Only a few people do, deep subject experts, but it's very confusing. Essentially, though, a mission statement only says what we're going to do. It doesn't say really how we're going to do it or what we're going to achieve. A vision statement says where we're going to end up, but it doesn't say what we're going to do to get there. Values are important to us, and so you can have a value statement, but that's just who we are. That doesn't, again, give us any. So what people tend to do at this point in time is they produce a document that has all of these headings in it, because they think that if I put in the mission statement, the vision, then the values and the objectives and the timeline and the desired outcomes, and I send that forward, surely that's a wonderful document that everybody can look at and read and think, yeah, I've got it, because it's all there. It's everything that I need in one single place. No, because that's like me throwing you a handful of balls and asking you to catch all of them instantly. It's not going to happen. People have only got the ability just to catch one ball, or maybe two if they're lucky. Now, the military understand this. And so the military, having written that great big long piece of work, which has everything in it, use something called intent. I intend to. So it's a much more powerful verb. And what you do essentially is you take snippets of all of the bits I've just been talking about and you put it into a précis. So it's a 100 word, and I'm not going to allow you any more than 100 words, a 100 word précis of all of those different elements. So you have in there a little bit of what the objectives are. You have in there a little bit of the style in which you're going to achieve it. You have in there a little bit of maybe the activities that are going to deliver it. Maybe you have in there something that you're going to put out of scope. So we're not going to do this to protect yourself from getting distracted, okay? And the idea is that an intent gives people the compass heading to go for. It doesn't give them so much detail that they know exactly what they're doing, but it gets everybody aligned. And that is the key word here. It's about alignment. When you're in a crisis, when you're in a fast-moving, fluid situation, you need everybody pointing in the same direction, and the direction you want people to travel in. By using this intent statement, you can get them pointing in that direction. If you're in quite a large organization, you can have different intents at different levels of the organization. So if I'm going on some sort of military campaign and I'm working for a general at the very top, the general's plan might be to be very cautious and only move each big unit forward when the other unit has gone firm on their objective. So he's not taking too much risk. He's waiting till he's sure that one is set before he moves another one of his chess pieces. But maybe for me, 6 or 7 layers down, in charge of a much, much smaller team, my intent is to be actually really quite high risk, because I'm the first force onto the ground. So I will need to take that first building, and I need to do it as riskily and as fast and as aggressively as I possibly can, so that the movement of that secure footing can start. And so that change, if you like, in intent will happen all the way down through the organization, from the general all the way down to me. But we're all aligned because I look to my boss's intent and work out how I'm going to achieve that, and so on and so forth. Now, what you're all screaming at me right now, silently into a screen, frustrated, is, well, what does one look like? So here we go. I wouldn't say this is necessarily best in class type of stuff, but it's not bad at all. Okay, we kick off straight away with what the big target objective is, right? To achieve a certain turnover by a certain date. Now, this might be, that you want to stay viable, stay soluble by the end of April. And let's bring it right back to the current situation. They've also then put in something about being in profit all the time. So there's a constraint there. We can't just go banging out all sorts of sales that we can't keep up with and that cost us a whole lot of money, because we've got to be in profit. So we've got to be careful of that. Then we've got a piece that survives definitely the Tiggy test. Okay, we will really go for this. It won't be safe and steady, but massive risks will be discussed. So that really helps anybody at any level understand how this journey is going to feel. All right, we are going to go for it. We're going to be dynamic. We're going to be risky, but let's not be too risky. Let's talk about it if we need to. Okay. Then they've got something in about the style. So they want to get away from contracts. They want people to stay with them because of how the clients feel. So now we've got not just about what the clients need or want, but we've got how the clients feel, that client emotion coming in, which is really helpful to people, because it's like, well, how do I make the client feel? What actions do I take to do that? And so on and so forth, okay? So you can start to see how this structures and comes together, and it starts to become a really powerful tool to give people an understanding of what we're going to do in outline, when we're going to do it by, the approach we're going to have, what we're going to want to try and achieve. And it's all in one place. And for reference and interest, if you are interested, when I was in the military, this was the only time that the CEO stood up to speak. The only time. The rest of the time when we're talking about the market, we're talking about the financials and everything else like that, that's given by everybody else. The CEO only stood up to speak to give the intent. It was considered that powerful because we felt that if everybody forgets everything but remembers the intent, we will be okay, because there's enough in there to align people and get them moving forwards. Okay, now let's move on to trust and have a look at trust, okay? If we've communicated what we now need to try and achieve, the problem in a fast-moving crisis situation is that you cannot conduct business in a hierarchical command and control fashion, okay? And that's why the military actually stopped doing command and control years and years and years ago. Believe it or not, actually the concept first came about in 1870 with a chap called Field Marshal von Moltke in the Prussian forces. So for a long time now, the military have understood that trust is tempo. If you want to be high tempo, you need to have a lot of trust within the organization. And you need to devolve decision-making down into the organization. So how do we go about devolving that? Because it's really interesting. There's a great book out there, I don't know if any of you have come across it, called Turn the Ship Around by David Marquet. Really great book written by a former US Navy submarine commander who talks about the fact that in order to get decision-making and breed that tempo, you need to push the authority down to the information, not drag the information up to the authority. But the issue for lots of people is, well, how do I go about that? You know, even if I look at this great article, which has come out very recently from McKinsey, and it talks about, you know, enabling people, empowering teams. Yeah, I get that, but isn't that then me losing control? So I want to talk to you about, again, about a concept or a technique that will help you with that. And it's called freedom in a framework, right? Or the military call it mission command. Fantastic book. If you haven't read it yet, Matthew Said's latest one, Rebel Ideas, starts to talk to a lot of this sort of area. In essence, what the military do and what McDonald's do, to give you a commercial example, is McDonald's say they understand that when they release a new recipe, when they release a new product onto the market and it goes globally, that the palate of people in Eastern Europe is very different from the palate of people in South America. But if they wait in a command and control style for the information to come up to them that this isn't really working very well in South America, and then the decision is made how to change the recipe and it goes all the way back down again, they've lost a huge amount of profit in that intervening time period. So what they do is within a set of parameters, like maybe an amount of money you're allowed to spend or a budget, and a certain number of restaurants you're allowed to trial it in, a certain number of ingredients you're allowed to change, they give the restaurant and the franchise owners and the regional directors latitude to change the recipe direct. So here on the screen, we've got it represented as a rectangle, but it could be any shape you like. It doesn't have to be regular sided. It can have all sorts of different sides. But essentially what you're doing is you are setting a number of parameters. And then within those parameters, your teams have the freedom, hence the word freedom within a framework, to come up with how they're going to achieve your outcomes and to make decisions themselves. So we're starting to knit this together now. We take the intent, because through that you've communicated where you want to get to, you've communicated what it might feel like, you've communicated some of the objectives and some of the style. You've now set the team some parameters to work inside, and now you just let them go because you have set the what and they are coming up with the how. In a crisis or fast-moving situation, leaders do not have the time to do all of the thinking and make the decisions. So hand the thinking across to your teams. They become much more innovative, much more creative. They come up with much better solutions than you will. But also, more importantly, they own the solutions that are being created because they've come up with them. So when you then make the decision and say, yes, we're going that way, they want to make it happen because it's their plan. Just one point though here, drawn from Matthew's book and shown by these pictures on the screen, okay? Be careful about who you put into those teams. If you only use the senior leadership team, you are going to be in the top rectangle, almost guaranteed. Because you will recruit people to your organization that you like and that fit your values. Over time, those individuals will be then promoted to similar standards. That means that in time, your senior leadership team are almost exactly the same type of person. So as we can see in the top diagram here, although you have all that problem space and you give them all this latitude to work in within the framework, they're all in the same area because they're all thinking in the same way. So you need to bring in diversity of thought. This is not the same as demographic diversity necessarily, okay? Because if that senior leadership team we've just been talking about is demographically very diverse, they still will end up thinking like the same people. So have a think about drawing into those teams some people who are really at the sharp end of delivery, right on that forefront of it, as well as maybe some senior people. Maybe bring in some clients, maybe bring in some suppliers, maybe bring in somebody from a financial area or a regulator if you're in a regulated environment. The point is you create a really diverse team that thinks about things very differently, and therefore they spread much more out across that problem space and can come up with much more innovative solutions. Okay, so now that we've looked at that, let's have a quick look at how we plan. Now there's loads of different ways to plan, okay? Lots and lots and lots of different ways to plan. And what I don't necessarily want to do is to go into every single way of planning, okay? Feel free to start popping your questions in if you'd like to, folks. Start to type them in so we can start to see them, because we are coming to the point now where I'll be winding up in a little bit, and it'd be good to have some of those questions coming in, so just so I can see and prepare a little bit in my head. So don't sit on your hands. Planning, okay? Again, same sort of principles as we had right at the start. Think about keeping it simple, but also accessible as a plan and very adaptable. If you are not careful, you spend a lot of time creating this gorgeous plan that's then set in stone. And if it is then set in stone, essentially, you then have to do version changes. So it becomes version 1 or version 2. And people get confused about which version you're actually on and in, all right? So it needs to be able to be flexed really simply. And this is where technology can really come in and help us. Now, you know, we're on Zoom at the moment doing this webinar, and I'm gazing lovingly into a camera lens, imagining that I'm looking you in the eye. So we've got technology helping us here already. But there's also technology that can help us in terms of the platform that we share our plans on. There's lots of different platforms like Asana and Trello. The one that I particularly like, and I use a lot within my own work, is MethodGrid. Shown here as a picture on the screen. Why do I like MethodGrid? Predominantly because it's a simple picture, and I work well with pictures. I don't necessarily work well with a plan that is a long written document. So if I can see a set of swim lanes of who is doing what, who is in what swim lane, and it's going chronologically left to right in a series of stages, as you can see on the screen here, that helps me get it. I can see it. I can color code it as to what's really important, what's less important, what only needs to be done for a medium risk type situation. But the other reason I like MethodGrid is because if you then click on any of these little tabs that are on you can see on your screen at the moment, colored, you know, yellow, orange, red, etc., they pop open, and inside them you can put things like checklists that you can design yourselves and edit really quickly. You can put in there videos. So let's say you want something on some instructions as to how to shut down a part of the plant that you're in. So you need people to understand which switches to throw when. You could write down a whole series of bullet point text to do that. Or, much more simply, you could record a video. You could record a video of you doing it. You could hang a video inside that particular element at that point in time. When somebody taps onto it, then they can just open it up, watch that video, and they've got instantly knowing exactly what they can do. And then they can do a checklist to tick it off. And there's text in there, you can hang web links in their documents. But all of these approaches, whether it's Teams or Asana or Trello, the reason why I like it is the accessibility and the version control. As soon as I update Method Grid, all of my team instantly get the same view, because when it's cloud-based and when they access it, they've got the updated version instantaneously. So simple stuff, I know, but useful. There's lots of planning processes, okay? But what I'll do is I'll talk you briefly through now a very simple one that the military use when we are in a really high intensity situation, okay? In an ambush, essentially. Or, you know, in 2008, when I was in a base in Afghanistan, there's 70 of us inside the base, and all of a sudden we're being attacked by 400 opponents coming towards us, all right? You've got to think rapidly and come up with a plan rapidly at that point in time. And this is how the military do it. And it's fairly logical, so I won't dwell on it too much. But start off with situational awareness. What is the situation and how is it affecting me? Okay. So right now, the environment that we're in with the coronavirus, it might be that that situation is affecting me personally. So that is the first thing I need to be aware of. Is how is this affecting me? It might also be affecting my team. It's also probably affecting my business. It might be affecting suppliers. So I start to list out, right, the ways in which the situation is having an effect around me. So now I've got a better understanding of what's going on by asking those better questions. Now, based on that situational awareness, I start to look at my objectives. So where do I want my team to be in a week's time? How much more reassured do I want them to be? What does success look like? The same for me personally and emotionally, the same for the business. So I start to work out my different objectives, and I'll have different objectives for the different situational awareness which is coming in. Then I start to consider options and choices as to how I could go about this, okay? And one thing I want to insist on here is that you do come up with different options, okay? This simple thing that we tend to do when we're in a crisis situation is do a very quick snap analysis, make a decision, and then we just say, right, that's what we're doing. I want you to do that slow down piece I mentioned at the start, okay? I want you to start to think about different ways in which you could achieve your outcomes. Very different ways indeed, not just subtly different, really different. Let me give you a quick example from when I was in Helmand province at one point, and we had an area to the west of us that was literally the heart of all darkness, right? You go anywhere near it and you end up in a massive fight because it was full of enemy fighters. So we had to do something about it. Now, the obvious plan A, if you like, from a military perspective is, well, you just bomb the place, right? You just level it because that's now dealt with the problem. Well, yes, of a fashion, but actually at the same time, you've destroyed the livelihoods for a whole bunch of innocent people and who you're meant to be there to protect. So when we looked at it at the time in 2008, actually the price of wheat seed was through the roof because of a failure of the crop in both Russia and Canada. So by offering to distribute wheat seed free to the tribal elders with a guarantee to buy it back, can we get the tribal elders to kick the enemy fighters out of the town? Because they can do that, because tribal elders are very powerful. So now we've got two very different ways of achieving exactly the same objective. So have a think about that as well, developing those different approaches. Then you move on to resources. It's important not to consider resource until this step. Why? Because the military understood that if you start out with resources, you always limit your ambition and you limit what you could come up with and being your creativity and your innovation when you're looking at those different options. So come up with the options and then look at the resources and how that might impact what you have to get rid of, or what you might bring more into. Or step 5, how you synchronize things better to deliver them. Finally, think about your controls. Once I start to launch this and I'm off, how do I stop myself getting distracted by shiny things? Okay, so that's a sort of series of steps within a plan that just help you come to a point at the end of it pretty swiftly. So thanks. I can see some questions now really starting to pop in, and we've got one from Claire and one from William, which we'll start to look at in a minute. So I think what we'll do, because James did set me the task of trying to talk for 45 minutes, So I'll try and finish actually on, on 45 minutes, quarter two. If I finish off with the test, and then we'll look at some of these other questions. So if we now start to look at testing, okay, and testing the plan. There's lots of different ways to run tests of the plan, but the important thing that I want you to think about is run some sort of test. Please, please don't come up with a plan that deals with the crisis you're currently facing and then just launch it and hope that it works. Take the time to at least kick the tires to make sure it's robust. You can do it in lots of different ways. De Bono's 6 hats and things like that, playing devil's advocate. You can do computer modeling if you want to, but that doesn't necessarily involve people and getting people on board. So there's a couple I'll actually talk you through just briefly. A red team, blue team approach and a pre-mortem. So the red team, blue team approach. Put simply, a blue team, and you want a small blue team, only 2 to 3 people max, champion the plan. They almost start at the imaginary day 0 and they start to work the plan out over time. And they say, this is what we're doing, this is when we're doing it, this is how we're doing it, this is who's involved. They describe the plan to a red team. The red team needs to be composed of all of the individuals who'll be affected by that plan. So it could be a client that you want to bring into the room for real. Why not? Why not bring a client in, put your plan in front of them and say, what do you think of this? Because you're starting to make this feel like more of a community now, and that everybody is engaged. It's not just some sort of client-supplier relationship. Bring in some suppliers if you want to. Do it under NDA, whatever arrangement you want to, is fine. Maybe you want a competitor, not in the room, but role-played. So get one of your team to role-play a competitor. But then you want your internal functions as well, maybe, like your marketing, your finance, your operations team, your HR, things like that. So that red team panel is there to critique and to challenge the plan, not necessarily always negatively, but to actually be constructive and say, well, I don't think we're being ambitious enough. Maybe we should take more risk. Okay, so they're being quite positive in that, in a way. You always want a third-party facilitation team to run these, okay? You always want somebody to manage the conversation, because otherwise it can go off down rabbit holes, or the really super confident individual can take over, or the individual who's not very confident can stay quiet even though they've got a fantastic thing to contribute. So make sure this one is facilitated. The other option I would offer you as a test, which is really short, sharp, and effective, but comes with a couple of caveats, is this pre-mortem approach, okay? Where essentially this is the opposite to the red team, blue team one. The red team, blue team, we started at imaginary day 0 and roll our plan out conceptually to see how it will get on and to identify the speed bumps and work out what we're going to do about it. Pre-mortem, you go all the way to the end. It's like worst case scenario and work your way back. So you go to the end of the plan. Let's say I have created a plan to survive for my business between now and September. I get everybody in the room and I can say we are now at September and we've gone bankrupt. We have failed. So it's pre-mortem. I then get people around the table to identify reasons why we will have failed. Everybody offers up those reasons, and then we have a discussion about the relative priorities of those reasons for failure. So we start to work out which are the biggest risks, which are the smaller risks, and we start to work out that priority order. What we then do very quickly is we start to work out how to mitigate against those biggest risks sitting at the top of the table, so that we are essentially going to the end and working our way back to avoid that worst case scenario happening. But again, a very simple test. It can cause difficulties if you're not careful, because people do tend to blame other individuals rather than themselves. So you have to set out some ground rules to try and avoid that, but I can talk about those in the Q&A session if we want to. So being in the military, I have to be on time, otherwise I get the heebie-jeebies. And James told me to talk until quarter 2. It is now bang on quarter 2. So we've got some questions in, and at that point, I'll take a quick drink of water, whilst James, you want to just do a quick summary and start to look at some of the questions.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Chris, for excellent, very thoughtful and sobering. Hearing you discuss Hellman sounded very sobering for us. We've got a few questions coming in. First of all, from Claire. who says, what you're talking about is the ideal situation. What if your management team are not aligned and the teams do not consist of the right people to make decisions? So it's around alignment and intent, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good challenge, Claire. You're quite right. We don't always end up with the perfect team, do we? And we don't always end up with the perfect situation. In that regard, you have to make do with and make best of the resources that you have. So if you do have people who just simply can't function like this and don't work, you've got to draw in the good people around you to get through the crisis. The question maybe that comes from that, the so what, if you like, that comes from that, is once you've got past the crisis and out the back end, what are you going to do about those individuals that aren't right within the business? What are you going to do about those managers that don't necessarily make the right decisions at the right time or don't enjoy doing it? And maybe it is time to move those individuals on. And sometimes crises are a very useful way for us to see who actually can step up to the plate and who can't. But you're quite right. When you end up in this crisis situation, you don't have the time to suddenly start doing staff training. So actually just deal with and work with the team that you've got around you. And if that is quite a small team and it is all very similar people and therefore they think in a similar way, I think you've probably just got to accept that for now so that you survive until you come out the other end.
Thank you. And the next question is from William McCready, who asked, the challenge here is sense of urgency versus panic or complacency. How do you think you can best steer clients or team members towards the former and avoid the latter? So how do you move towards urgency rather than panic and complacency when working at pace?
Okay. Yeah, I suppose this is the issue. The issue we have here is that it depends on sector often. So certain sectors are loath to move forward. Other sectors are very good at it. So certain industries, if you like, are certainly the creative industries. They move at quite a fast pace already. And therefore, they're quite used to moving to that sense of urgency. For other industry sectors, it's not necessarily the case. So I see from William's question that he's within the charity sector. And therefore, you've got trustees who are tend to be quite slow at their thoughts and their processes. They want to be very sure about what's going on because they feel the weight of responsibility of making sure that the charity is always going to be there and be viable because that's what they're there to do as a trustee or a member of it. Or some of the more national industries or the national charities that are out there, like the National Trust, etc. People operate in a specific way in different industries, in different areas. And I've worked in the public sector, private sector, third sector. So I think, that you're quite right. If you're John Cotter and his 8 levers of change, then the first one is a sense of urgency. And how do you generate that sense of urgency? And I think essentially, John, it's about doing a damn. It's about laying out those facts barefaced in front of them. If we do not do something, and if we don't do it by this time, this organization is going to go under. Okay, and you've kind of got to be not confrontational, but be willing to actually state it and state it up front. When you're in a crisis situation, you don't have the time to always manage people's feelings and sensitivities. You've got to get out there and make sure they understand it. So I'd suggest probably the only way to do it is to make it very clear about what's going to happen. There's a great CEO that I know, our Brother UK, a guy called Phil Jones, and he talks a lot about evidence over emotion. So if you want people to start to move forward, you've got to put the evidence in front of them as to why that needs to happen, and that then generates the emotion and the sense of urgency behind it. I know that's not a best answer ever, William, but it's difficult for me to answer to every type of situation for everybody on the webinar.
Thank you. And if I may, a quick question from me. I'm always fascinated the sort of context themselves in. And I was in Brown, everyone's saying they wanted Gordon Brown was ISIS. Boris's manner tends to be more kind of jocular, and he's more. How do different leaders with different styles adapt to a changing situation?
So it's not necessarily about different styles. It's about the different styles to suit the context at the time. And there's also being very wary of what I call leadership lag. So when we are in a very intense, very high-powered situation, we by default will kick into quite a directive style of leadership because we have to. We haven't got the time, so we need people to be told what we're going to do, when we're going to do it. Let's get something moving forward in the direction so that we don't fall over. What some people then do is they suffer leadership lag. So when the situation changes and we've now got the ability to take a bit of a breath and slow down, individuals are still in that leadership directive frame of mind, and they forget that we're now into a more relaxed environment. And those individuals who have started to relax are now being led by somebody who's being really punchy and really directive, and it clashes with them because they're like, well, hang on a minute, we've just been through that. I now needed some time to relax and to unwind a little bit. So it's about understanding, being very aware of the situation at the time, but also, I think, as a leader, about trying to drive the context as much as you can and to shape the situation as much as you can. So recognizing the fact that you as a leader feel we are now just starting to enter a point at which we can slow down and think. So straight away, your leadership starts to change so that you can then create that sense of calmness and sereneness with the rest of the team and allow them to wind down a little bit.
Yeah. Next question, relating to the side book. How do you deal with people, teams not creating good enough solutions when you give them freedom? In the current situation, it's not possible to change the people, so it feels like the only option is to handhold or help solve directly. That's from Joseph.
Yeah, Joseph, so there's a third part of the technique, what we call the Trinity. So I talked to you about intent, I talked to you about freedom in a framework. There's a third part which is called closed loop communication. So the way in which the military always used to use these three tools, and actually closed loop communication comes from surgery and comes from operating theatres, to make sure that everybody is understood. It's kind of like a way of making sure that I've not just told you what needs to happen, but that you now tell me back what your understanding is so that I can check your understanding and you close that loop. So the way in which we do it, and we did it in the military, was that having given the intent, having given the freedom, we then allowed the teams just enough time to start to come up with their initial thoughts, not a full plan, just their initial thoughts. You need to give them enough time to have a think, because otherwise they'll just parrot fashion back to you what you've already told them. But if you give them too long and they come up with a plan that just, as you said, has no real good ideas and is a bit pointless, they're now emotionally wedded to it and want it to continue. So they don't like you messing around with it. And so that's where this freedom in a framework piece gets a bit difficult. So actually what you do is you give them maybe a couple of hours, a couple of days, however long you want to give them, and then you ask them to check back in with you and close that loop. So they start to describe and tell you what they're thinking about. And you can then start to look at and think about, well, does that stuff make sense? Or can I enter into more of a, coaching type of conversation to ease them towards, well, what else did you think about? What else could you have thought about? What else were parts of your considerations? So using that technique, you can start to deal with that.
Great, thank you. We have MF O'Hare question here. As a young person joining a large corporate in their leadership team, what tips would you give for early actions to build trust and bring people with me, as I need their buy-in to drive change and to deliver the strategic plan that we will jointly deliver?
Yeah, and it's a good question. I think that the issue here is that in the commercial world, we tend to have to wait for trust to build up. In the military world, it's a lot easier because we just give trust straight away. I can't afford to walk out of the gate on a patrol with somebody that's new to the team and wait to build up trust in them, because I might be trusting them with my life right now as soon as we walk out the gate. So we give it instinctively and wait for it to be lost. So I think that's maybe MF O'Hare's option. Start to show and demonstrate absolute trust in other people and in the hierarchy around you. And they will see that and they will probably reciprocate back in the same way. Also, obviously, doing the best you can at the jobs that you do, but also seeking a bit of guidance and offering ideas and being creative, I think all shows that you are a person prepared to go that extra yard, that extra mile. That always, it doesn't always, some people find it irritating as leaders. Personally, I find it great because I like to see somebody who's bright, who's sparky, who wants to give ideas. And as those ideas are being shown to be more and more valuable, that leads me to trust them more. So maybe those two different ways, giving trust in both directions. And if you start, others will reciprocate, but also there's ways in which you can make that happen.
And maybe sort of building on that, Joel's question here is around any guidance on providing psychological safety for the team in a crisis where big changes are required.
Yeah, Joel, you've got to set the safe space before you walk into it. So a lot of when we're doing these tests, a lot of the work that we do as an organisation for our clients is running those tests I spoke to you about, pre-mortems and the red team, blue team stuff. That requires a psychological safe space. So we will work quite hard before we actually go into the room to do that test, to meet with people beforehand, to talk to them about what we're going to talk about. So they're getting a preemptive, if you like, briefing, to understand what they're thinking at that point in time, to understand where their emotions are, to help to describe to them that actually it's really important that we go in there and we share honestly, openly, because that draws out the good ideas, and then we can move forward from those. But people aren't going to be reprimanded for anything that they say in there. But this is seen as stepping outside of normal business as usual to identify all the things we need to do and then step back into it. So Joel, a lot of it is about doing a bit of work up front rather than just saying, tomorrow we're going to have a test. I want the following people to come to it. And as they walk into the room, you tell them what's going to happen. That won't really help.
Great. And probably the last question we have time for, given where we are, is from Louisa. With the idea of keeping it simple and keeping the focus, in our current situation, how much ahead do you think it's realistic to plan?
Louisa, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I am not going to state a time. I am not going to state a number of weeks or a number of months, because it's just a massive poo trap that I'd be about to fall into. I'd say it kind of comes down to individual companies and organizations. I know at the moment how much capital I have available to me, either in my bank or what I can immediately lay my hands on. I know how long that is going to last me. So that has become my timeline that I'm operating to. I need to have an answer and a plan for the time I have from now until I run out of money, essentially. That could be one metric that you could use. For others, it could be that they want to actually try and work out something a bit more set as a time in a line. Just go, we're going to do the next 3 months because we think this might last 3 months. And you can go away and do all sorts of analysis. I think that in terms of, objectives and number of objectives, you're quite right within your question as well, Louisa. Keep the number of objectives low. Keep them simple. Like I said right at the very start of this, focus, focus, focus. Shorter timelines than you would already normally operate on. Much fewer objectives, because nothing empowers a team and an organization. Nothing raises the morale and the motivation of that organization more than having success. That happens all the time, but especially in a crisis. And it's probably a nice point to end on, to go across to James to sum up now. If you set simple, relatively low-hanging fruit objectives at short timelines, and every single one you smash as an organization, people start to believe in it, people start to move forward. And I wish everybody on the webinar a huge amount of success in doing that, and all the very best indeed. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And yes, so just to say as well, thank you so much for all of you for signing up and attending our webinar and all your great questions. I think, yeah, loads of really useful hints and tips there from Chris. I think, yeah, clarity of communication, keeping ahead of the situation, remember also applying some of those processes and planning techniques and frameworks to navigate through a very challenging situation. And yes, I just want to say on behalf of Fresh Minds, I wish you all sort of to be safe and well in the coming months. And I hope you'll join me in a virtual, very loud clap for Chris for a really fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Our next talk is Thursday next week, where we have Terry McBride talking about psychological safety. So I look forward to seeing you then. Thank you so much. Have a lovely sunny afternoon. Bye-bye.